As the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the affluent neighborhood of Ridgewood Heights in a soft, amber glow, Lila Bennett, 34 years old, stood silently by the window of her sleek, modern apartment. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently to the ground in the small garden below, painting a picture of tranquility. Lila rested her hand on her slightly rounded belly, 5 months into her pregnancy. Each time she felt the life growing within her, a serene sense of joy washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the complicated shadows of her past. Yet, as she gazed out at the picturesque scene before her, memories began to creep back, memories of a family that had never truly embraced her for who she was. 2 years ago, at her father Edward Bennett's grand 60th birthday celebration, held in their sprawling family estate, Lila had been reminded once again of how out of place she was in their world. The party had been nothing short of opulent. Champagne flowed freely as New York's elite mingled under glittering chandeliers. Her mother, Vivian Bennett, approached her with a scrutinizing gaze and a sharp tongue. "Oh, Lila," Vivian began with an exaggerated smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That dress, did you pick it up on sale?" The words dripped with condescension as Vivian's own Chanel ensemble sparkled under the lights. Lila had smiled politely and replied simply, "Yes, I like it." But Vivian wasn't finished. "Well," she continued loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "with your husband's salary, I suppose that's understandable." Lila's sister Amelia joined in soon after. Draped in Hermes and adorned with diamonds that caught every flicker of light, Amelia smirked as she approached. "Lila," she said mockingly, "it's so rare to see you at these events. You usually avoid us for your simpler lifestyle." Her words stung more than Lila cared to admit. Amelia had always been the golden child, the one who stayed close to their parents' side and reaped the rewards of their wealth and influence. She worked as a sales director at their father's real estate company but lacked any real skill or dedication. Yet Edward spoke of her as if she were a prodigy destined to carry on his legacy. Lila overheard him boasting to a guest that night, "Amelia is the future of Bennett Real Estate. She has an extraordinary talent for leadership." Lila couldn't help but smirk bitterly to herself. Amelia's so-called talent was little more than throwing lavish parties and charming investors with empty promises. Later that evening, Edward approached Lila directly for what felt like the first time all night. "You came," he said curtly, his smile more formal than warm. "Happy birthday," Lila replied softly. Edward wasted no time turning the conversation toward Jason Carter, Lila's husband and president of a modest real estate company. "Is Jason working tonight?" he asked with thinly veiled disdain. When Lila nodded, Edward added dismissively, "Well, being the head of such a small firm must be demanding." The night ended with Vivian delivering what felt like a final blow. "It's decided," she said coldly beneath layers of makeup and jewels. "Amelia will inherit your father's company. You've chosen your path, away from us, and you have no say in this matter." Those words had lingered with Lila long after she left that evening. Now standing by her window 2 years later, Lila opened her eyes as those memories scattered like leaves in the wind. Her phone buzzed on the counter beside her, a message from an unknown number. "Are you ready to face the truth?" Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the screen. The words felt heavy with meaning but offered no clarity about what lay ahead. "Are you okay?" Jason's voice broke through her thoughts as he stepped into the room behind her. His tone was gentle but filled with concern, a stark contrast to the cold voices from her past that still echoed in her mind. Jason had just returned from work but made it a point to check on Lila before doing anything else. "Yes," she replied with a soft smile as she turned toward him. In her simple dress and unadorned appearance, Lila stood as a testament to everything opposite from the ostentatious world she had grown up in, a world she had deliberately left behind. But deep within her eyes was something new, resolve. She wasn't running anymore. Whatever truth awaited her now, she was ready to face it head-on. The following Saturday arrived with a crisp breeze sweeping through Ridgewood Heights, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. Lila stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the soft folds of a navy maternity dress that Jason had picked out for her. It was simple yet elegant, a reflection of her own understated style. Tonight, she would face her family at La Maison d'Or, a confrontation she had avoided for far too long. Jason entered the room, his tie slightly askew, but his expression calm and steady. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and reassuring. Lila nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her rounded belly. "I need to do this," she replied. "It's not just about me anymore, it's about protecting what we've built and making sure our child doesn't grow up under their shadow." The drive to La Maison d'Or was quiet but heavy with unspoken thoughts. The restaurant loomed in the distance like a fortress of opulence, its Art Deco facade glowing under the city lights. As they pulled up to the valet, Jason reached over and gently squeezed Lila's hand. "Whatever happens in there," he said firmly, "we're in this together." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and aged wine. The maitre d' greeted them with a polished smile, before escorting them to a private dining room at the back of the restaurant. The moment Lila stepped through the door, she felt the weight of her family's presence. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her posture regal, but her eyes sharp and calculating. Edward was beside her, his expression unreadable, but his fingers drumming nervously against his glass. Amelia leaned back in her chair with a practiced smirk, scrolling through her phone as though she had better places to be. "Lila," Vivian said smoothly as they entered, her voice dripping with feigned warmth. "You made it." She gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of the table. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten about us." "I'm right on time," Lila replied evenly, taking her seat without breaking eye contact. The first few minutes were filled with forced pleasantries and shallow compliments about the restaurant's decor. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. It wasn't until dessert was served, a decadent chocolate soufflé, that Vivian finally dropped the pretense. "So," she began, setting down her spoon with deliberate care. "I assume you've heard about some challenges we've been facing at Bennett Enterprises." Lila raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing Vivian to continue. "It's nothing we can't handle," Vivian added quickly, glancing at Edward for support. "But it has become clear that we need all hands on deck to steer the company back on course." "And by all hands, you mean me?" Lila asked, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Exactly," Amelia interjected before Vivian could respond. "You've spent enough time playing house with Jason, it's time you stepped up and did something meaningful for this family." Jason's jaw tightened beside Lila, but he remained silent, letting her take the lead. "I see," Lila said slowly, leaning back in her chair. "And what exactly would my role entail?" Vivian smiled thinly. "We'd need you to leverage Jason's connections in real estate development to secure new partnerships and investments." "And in return?" Lila pressed. "You'd be welcomed back into the family fold," Edward said gruffly, finally speaking up. "With all the privileges that come with it." Lila let out a soft laugh, one that held no humor. "So let me get this straight," she said, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "You want me to exploit my husband's hard-earned reputation to clean up your mess? And in exchange, I get, what? Your approval?" Vivian's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Don't be so dramatic, Lila," she said dismissively. "This is about preserving our legacy, your legacy." "My legacy?" Lila repeated incredulously. She leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "My legacy is standing right here beside me." She gestured toward Jason before placing a protective hand on her belly. "And it has nothing to do with your lies or your greed." The room fell silent except for the faint clink of Amelia's spoon against her plate as she resumed eating dessert as though nothing had happened. Vivian's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake," she said coldly. "No," Lila replied firmly as she rose from her chair. "I made my choice years ago when I walked away from all of this." She glanced around the table one last time before adding, "And I don't regret it, not for a second." Jason stood as well, placing a supportive hand on Lila's back as they turned to leave. "Lila," Edward called after them, his voice tinged with desperation for the first time that evening. But she didn't look back. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Lila felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her, a weight lifted from her shoulders after years of carrying it alone. Before I tell you what happened next, the moment my family's carefully constructed facade came crashing down, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against impossible odds? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe in choosing integrity over appearances, hit that like button, because this journey is far from over. The dining room at La Maison d'Or was filled with an air of tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Emma sat silently, her gaze steady as she faced her family across the table. The remnants of their lavish meal, half-empty wine glasses, crumpled napkins, and dessert plates, were scattered before them, but no one reached for another bite. Jason stood by her side, his presence a calm yet commanding force in the room. Michelle broke the silence first, her voice laced with false sweetness. Emma, darling, it's such a shame you were late tonight. We had hoped to celebrate your baby shower properly. She gestured to the empty plates as if they were proof of her good intentions. Emma didn't flinch. The reservation was for 7:30, she said evenly, pulling up the message on her phone. You told me to be here at that time. Charlotte leaned back in her chair with a smirk, swirling the last drops of wine in her glass. Oh, come on, Emma. It's not a big deal. You've always been forgetful about these things. Jason's voice cut through the room like steel. Enough. He placed a leather briefcase on the table with deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the quiet space. We're not here to argue about dinner reservations. Michelle's smile faltered as Jason snapped open the briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. What is this? Howard asked, his voice gruff but tinged with unease. This, Jason began calmly, is evidence of fraudulent transactions conducted by Baker Real Estate over the past 5 years. He slid the first document across the table toward Howard, whose face turned pale as he scanned its contents. That's ridiculous, Michelle interjected quickly, her voice rising in pitch. You don't know what you're talking about. Jason ignored her and continued, his tone steady but unyielding. False invoices, embezzled funds, illegal loans, it's all here. Your company has been operating on borrowed time, siphoning money to maintain appearances while spiraling deeper into debt. Charlotte's smirk disappeared as Jason turned his attention to her. And you, he said, sliding another document across the table, have been reporting fictitious sales figures to justify your inflated salary. Your so-called position at Baker Real Estate is nothing more than a facade. Charlotte's face turned crimson as she stammered, that's not true. I've been working hard. Really? Jason interrupted sharply. Because according to these records, your work consists of attending luxury events and charging personal expenses to the company account. Michelle slammed her hand on the table, her carefully composed demeanor unraveling. How dare you come in here and accuse us like this? We are your family. Emma finally spoke, her voice calm but resolute. Family? You've spent years looking down on me and my choices, mocking my marriage, my lifestyle, all while hiding behind lies and deceit. Don't talk to me about family. Howard tried to regain control of the situation, his tone gruff but desperate. Emma, we can work this out privately. There's no need to involve outsiders. Jason leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. It's too late for that. He pulled out one final document and placed it in front of Howard. This is a notice of intent to report all findings to federal authorities unless immediate action is taken. The room descended into chaos as Michelle and Charlotte began speaking over each other in frantic tones, denials mixed with pleas, but Emma remained silent, watching as years of arrogance and pretense crumbled before her eyes. Finally, Howard slumped back in his chair, defeated. His voice was barely audible as he muttered, "What do you want from us?" Emma stood slowly, placing a protective hand over her belly as she looked each of them in the eye. "I don't want anything from you," she said firmly. "This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability." She turned toward Jason and nodded slightly before adding, "You have 24 hours to decide how you want to handle this. After that, we let justice take its course." As Emma and Jason walked out of La Maison d'Or into the crisp night air, she felt an unfamiliar sense of closure settling over her, a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years finally lifting from her shoulders. The private dining room at La Maison d'Or was cloaked in an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware against fine china. Emma sat at the far end of the table, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression calm but unyielding. Across from her, her mother Michelle adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck, a nervous habit she hadn't displayed in years. Her father Howard avoided eye contact altogether, staring intently at the empty wine glass in front of him. Charlotte, however, leaned back in her chair with a smug smile, scrolling through her phone as if the tension in the room didn't concern her. Emma, Michelle began, her voice carefully measured, I think we've all had enough drama for one evening. Let's not blow things out of proportion. Emma tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Blowing things out of proportion? You set me up to arrive late to my own baby shower and then tried to pin a $2,000 bill on me. Forgive me if I'm not exactly in the mood to let this slide. Charlotte let out a soft laugh, setting her phone down on the table. Oh, come on, Emma. Don't be so sensitive. It was just a misunderstanding. Jason's voice cut through the room like a blade. A misunderstanding? He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents. Because from where I stand, it looks more like a pattern. Howard finally looked up, his face pale as Jason placed the documents on the table and slid them toward him. What is this? Howard asked, his voice gruff but unsteady. Jason's tone was calm but firm. These are financial records from Baker Real Estate over the past 5 years, records that paint a very clear picture of fraud and embezzlement on an alarming scale. Michelle's hand froze mid-adjustment of her necklace. That's absurd, she said sharply. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Jason replied coolly, flipping open the top document to reveal a series of falsified invoices. These invoices were submitted under shell companies that don't exist, companies you created to funnel money out of Baker Real Estate and into private accounts. He turned to Charlotte next. And you've been reporting inflated sales figures to justify your exorbitant salary while contributing nothing of actual value to the company. Charlotte's face turned red as she sputtered, That's not true. I've worked hard. Really? Jason interrupted, sliding another document across the table. Because according to this report, your work consists of attending luxury events and charging personal expenses to the company account. Howard slammed his hand on the table, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. This is outrageous. You have no right to come in here and accuse us like this. Emma finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. No right? After years of belittling me and my choices, mocking my marriage and my lifestyle, you think I owe you silence? You've spent your entire lives hiding behind lies and pretense while looking down on anyone who dared live differently. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Howard's. You don't get to play the victim now. Michelle stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. We did what we had to do to protect this family's legacy, she snapped. Jason raised an eyebrow. Protect it? By committing fraud? By dragging your company, and your family name, into financial ruin? He pulled out one final document and placed it in front of Howard. This is a notice of intent to report all findings to federal authorities unless immediate action is taken. The room erupted into chaos as Michelle and Charlotte began shouting over each other, denials mixed with desperate justifications, but Howard remained silent, his face ashen as he stared at the document before him. Emma stood slowly, placing a protective hand over her belly as she addressed them one last time. You have 24 hours to decide how you want to handle this, she said firmly. After that, we let justice take its course. As Emma and Jason turned to leave, Michelle reached out desperately. Emma. Please, we're family. Emma paused at the door but didn't turn around. Her voice was calm but resolute as she replied, Not anymore. The heavy brass door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the now silent room. The courtroom was silent, save for the methodical tapping of the judge's gavel as the proceedings began. Emma sat in the gallery, her hands resting protectively on her now 6-month pregnant belly. Jason was beside her, his calm presence a steadying force amid the tension that filled the room. Across from them, seated at the defendant's table, were Michelle, Howard, and Charlotte Baker. The once proud family now looked like shadows of their former selves. Michelle's perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, Howard's shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt, and Charlotte clutched a handkerchief as though it were her last lifeline. The prosecutor began with a damning statement. Your Honor, today we present overwhelming evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct perpetrated by the defendants over several years. These actions not only defrauded investors but also tarnished the reputation of an entire industry. One by one, documents were presented, false invoices, doctored financial statements, and records of illegal loans. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the Bakers' carefully constructed facade. Michelle buried her face in her hands as the prosecutor revealed her personal misuse of company funds for luxury spa visits and high-end shopping sprees. Charlotte's composure cracked when her fictitious sales reports were exposed, showing how she had siphoned money to maintain her extravagant lifestyle. Howard sat motionless as the depth of his company's insolvency was laid bare. Jason took the stand next, his testimony clear and precise. He recounted everything, from the fraudulent dinner reservation to years of deceptive practices uncovered through meticulous investigation. His words were measured but carried an undeniable weight that left no room for doubt. As Jason stepped down, Emma felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. This wasn't just about justice, it was about finally breaking free from a legacy built on lies. When it was time for sentencing, the judge's voice rang out with authority. Howard Baker is hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in orchestrating systemic fraud and embezzlement. Michelle Baker will serve 3 years for misappropriation of funds and aiding in fraudulent activities. Charlotte Baker is sentenced to 2 years in prison with an additional 4 years suspended for falsifying financial records and benefiting from illicit gains. The courtroom murmured as the verdicts were delivered. Emma watched as her family reacted, Howard stared blankly ahead, Michelle sobbed quietly into her hands, and Charlotte trembled uncontrollably. The empire they had built on deceit was gone, replaced by consequences they could no longer escape. Outside the courthouse, sunlight streamed down onto the steps where Emma and Jason stood together. "Are you okay?" Jason asked softly, his hand brushing hers. Emma nodded slowly. "Yes," she said with a small smile. "For the first time in years. I feel free." The weeks that followed saw Baker real estate liquidated to pay off debts and fines. The family mansion was seized, its grand halls emptied of their opulence and pride. Michelle and Howard entered prison as mere shadows of their former selves, while Charlotte retreated to a quiet town far from Chicago to live out her suspended sentence in anonymity. 3 years later, Emma stood by the window of her cozy home in Lake Forest, watching golden leaves swirl in the autumn breeze. Her daughter Ashley giggled in the garden below, holding up a drawing of colorful flowers for her mother to see. "Mommy! Look what I made!" Ashley called out excitedly. "It's beautiful," Emma said warmly as she waved back at her daughter. Jason appeared behind her with 2 cups of tea in hand. "Thinking about them again?" he asked gently. "Not really," Emma replied honestly. "I heard from a friend that my mother was released from prison last month, but I haven't felt any need to reach out." Jason placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've done what you needed to do, to protect yourself and Ashley." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I don't regret anything," she said firmly. "We chose honesty over appearances, integrity over deceit, and that's why we're here today." Their lives had changed drastically over those 3 years. Jason's hospitality group had grown into one of Chicago's most respected brands, yet they continued to live simply, eschewing luxury for authenticity and valuing what truly mattered, family built on trust and love. As dusk settled over Lake Forest, Emma felt a deep sense of peace wash over her, a peace born not from revenge or triumph but from knowing she had chosen the right path for herself and her child. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the final day of the trial began. Emma sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly together, her breath steady but deliberate. The weight of years of betrayal and manipulation seemed to hang in the air, but she felt stronger now, stronger than she ever had before. Jason sat beside her, his presence grounding her as they waited for the final verdict. The prosecutor rose to deliver his closing argument. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of authority as he laid out the case against Michelle, Howard, and Charlotte Baker. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge with a measured tone, "this case is not just about numbers on a ledger or falsified documents. It is about trust that was broken not only within a family but also with investors, employees, and the community that relied on Baker real estate. The defendants built an empire on lies and greed, and today we ask this court to hold them accountable." Emma watched as her mother Michelle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her once impeccable composure now unraveling. Howard stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly, while Charlotte fidgeted nervously with a pen, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The defense attorney stood next, attempting to paint a picture of misunderstanding and desperation. "The Bakers," he argued, "are not criminals, they are victims of circumstance. They made mistakes, yes, but these were errors born out of a desire to protect their family legacy during challenging economic times." Jason leaned over and whispered to Emma, "They're still trying to spin this as if they're the victims." Emma nodded slightly but said nothing. She knew the truth would prevail. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell silent. After reviewing all evidence presented, he began solemnly, "This court finds Howard Baker guilty of orchestrating fraudulent activities amounting to millions of dollars in damages. Michelle Baker is found guilty of misappropriation of funds and aiding in these fraudulent schemes. Charlotte Baker is found guilty of falsifying financial records and benefiting from illicit gains." The sentences were delivered one by one. Howard received 7 years in federal prison, Michelle was sentenced to 5 years, Charlotte received 3 years with an additional 2 years probation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the weight of justice settled over the room. Emma exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. She hadn't wanted things to come to this, but she knew it was necessary. For too long, her family had lived behind a facade of wealth and power while leaving destruction in their wake. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Jason shielded Emma with his arm as they made their way through the crowd. One reporter called out, "Emma, do you have anything to say about your family's downfall?" Emma paused for a moment before turning to face them. Her voice was steady as she replied, "This isn't about their downfall, it's about accountability. No one is above the law, not even family." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of headlines and legal proceedings as Baker Real Estate was dismantled piece by piece. The company's assets were liquidated to pay off debts and fines, and its once proud name became synonymous with scandal. But for Emma, life moved forward in quieter ways. 3 years later, she stood in the kitchen of her modest but cozy home in Lake Forest, watching Ashley, now a bright-eyed toddler, play in the backyard with Jason. Autumn leaves swirled around them as Ashley laughed and chased after her father. Emma smiled softly as she sipped her tea. The life she had built was far removed from the opulence of her upbringing, but it was real. It was hers. A letter arrived that evening, a formal envelope bearing her mother's handwriting. Emma hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single page filled with words that felt both foreign and familiar, apologies for past mistakes, pleas for forgiveness, and an invitation to reconnect. Jason noticed her silence as she read the letter. "What does it say?" he asked gently. Emma folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "It doesn't change anything," she said quietly but firmly. "I've already made peace with my past." That night, as Emma tucked Ashley into bed and kissed her forehead goodnight, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for what she had lost but for what she had gained: freedom from toxicity, clarity about who she wanted to be, and a future defined by love rather than fear. Standing by the window once more as dusk settled over Lake Forest, Emma reflected on how far she had come. The shadows of Ridgewood Heights no longer haunted her, they were merely echoes of a life she had left behind. The autumn breeze carried a crisp chill through the quiet streets of Lake Forest, swirling leaves in shades of amber and gold. Emma stood by the window of her cozy home, watching her 2-year-old daughter, Ashley, play in the garden. The little girl's laughter echoed through the air as she held up a drawing of colorful flowers. "Mommy! Look what I made!" Ashley called out, her voice full of excitement and innocence. Emma smiled warmly, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she replied, waving back at her daughter. The scene before her was a stark contrast to the life she had left behind, a life filled with pretense, manipulation, and hollow relationships. Now, every day felt like a gift, a reminder of the strength it took to walk away from toxicity and build something real. Jason appeared behind her, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. He placed one gently on the windowsill beside her and wrapped an arm around her waist. "She's growing up so fast," he said softly, his gaze fixed on Ashley. Emma nodded. "She is, and she's growing up in a world where she'll never have to question whether love is conditional or whether honesty comes second to appearances." Jason kissed her temple lightly. "You've given her that world," he said. "We've given her that world." As they stood there together, Emma's thoughts drifted to the past, the courtroom, the trial, and the aftermath that had reshaped their lives forever. Howard Baker, once the proud patriarch of Chicago's real estate elite, was now serving his sentence in federal prison. His arrogance had crumbled under the weight of his crimes, leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. Michelle Baker had been released from prison just a month ago, but she lived in obscurity now, stripped of the wealth and status she had clung to so desperately. Charlotte had retreated to a small town far from Chicago, living quietly and trying to rebuild a life out of the ashes of her choices. A week ago, Emma had received a letter from Charlotte, a heartfelt apology filled with regret and pleas for reconciliation. But Emma hadn't responded. She had made peace with her past and felt no need to reopen wounds that had finally healed. "Do you think about them often?" Jason asked gently, as if sensing her thoughts. "Not really," Emma replied honestly. "Sometimes I wonder if they've found any sense of clarity or if they're still trapped in their own illusions." She paused before adding, "But it doesn't matter anymore. Their choices are theirs to live with, just as mine are mine." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "And you made the right ones." Emma turned to face him fully, placing a hand on his chest. "We made the right ones," she corrected with a smile. The Miller family had grown stronger over the past 3 years, not just emotionally but also professionally. Jason's hospitality group had expanded significantly, earning respect across Chicago for its commitment to quality and integrity. Yet despite their success, they continued to live modestly, valuing simplicity and authenticity over luxury or pretense. As dusk settled over Lake Forest and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't just free from her family's shadow, she was free to live a life defined by love, honesty, and purpose. Before we close this chapter of my story, a journey filled with heartbreak but also healing, I want to thank you for being here with me every step of the way. Your support means everything. If this story resonated with you or inspired you in any way, please hit that like button, it helps us reach more amazing viewers like you. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories about resilience, growth, and finding your own path in life. Now tell me, have you ever had to break free from something toxic to find your own happiness? Share your story in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. And remember, no matter how difficult it may seem at first, choosing truth and integrity will always lead you toward a brighter future. With love and gratitude, Emma.